All right, good morning, everyone. Thanks for inviting me here to join the event today and provide a little bit of an overview about drought and kind of the current situation with the drought in the North Saskatchewan Watershed, which is the one that we are in right now, the North Saskatchewan River Watershed. So my name is Rosa Matovich. I'm a watershed planning coordinator with the North Saskatchewan Watershed Alliance. And so you might have heard a little bit about Alberta being in a drought this year. Hands up if you've heard that. Yeah, it might be a little bit of a hot topic right now. It's also the case right across Canada right now. So at the end of March, 66% of the country was classified as being in abnormally dry or exceptionally dry. And in the prairie provinces in particular, that number reaches up to like as high as 95%. So we're in a pretty decent drought right now. So in my presentation today, I'm going to talk a little bit, start off with like, who is the North Saskatchewan Watershed Alliance? What do we do? And talk a little bit about the North Saskatchewan River Watershed. I'm going to talk about water supply and demand and a little bit about what water management looks like for the river. And then I'm going to talk about some different definitions of drought and then kind of the history of drought in the watershed and for the river. And then kind of talk about the current state of drought and then end on kind of some drought resiliency things that we can do. So before we dive into talking about drought in the North Saskatchewan River Watershed, I kind of want to talk a little bit about the organization I work for. So the North Saskatchewan Watershed Alliance, we're a watershed planning and advisory council, and there's 11 of us across the province, one for each of the major rivers in the province. And we bring people, governments, and different sectors across the watershed together to talk about and discuss water-related issues and to try to work collaboratively to come up with and implement solutions to deal with those issues. So for those of you who've never seen this map, this is the North Saskatchewan River Watershed. So you can see the blue line is the river going through the landscape. So hands up if you know what a watershed is. Hands up if you've ever heard of like a drainage basin. That's kind of a more common one. Yeah, so watershed is kind of the fancy sciencey term that we use to describe an area of land that collects precipitation and water and drains it towards a water body. So that can be a lake, a river, a wetland, a stream. And something with watersheds is that if you look at this map of the whole North Saskatchewan River watershed, you'll notice, how do I make the little, does this have a pointer on it? Do you know, Amber? Does it have like the laser pointer? No. Oh, there we go. Perfect. Now I don't have to hand gesture wildly at you all morning. So if you notice, this is the full North Saskatchewan River watershed. So this is the entire land area that drains to the big river. But you'll notice that there's kind of like these little puzzle pieces that are smaller watersheds. So we can define watersheds at different scales depending on which water body we're talking about. So you can kind of think of them as almost like the Russian nesting dolls, where you can kind of go from really small for like a single lake or a single little creek, all the way up to a huge river, all the way up to like continental scale watersheds, depending on the scale you're looking at. But anyway, so the important thing to remember is that we all live in a watershed, and what we do on the land impacts the water because it travels across the land. For the North Saskatchewan River watershed, it's 50,000 kilometers squared, and it starts in the mountains, kind of around, that's not the right button, kind of in the Banff National Park, and it drains east across the province through Edmonton, and then it continues east to the Saskatchewan border and keeps going, and eventually reaches Hudson's Bay. So most of the water in the river is produced in the western part of the landscape because we get a lot of snow in the mountains, which then melts and kind of turns into the water in the river. And it flows downstream and to provide water for 1.7 million people in our watershed. So we have a pretty big population. Another thing that I'm going to mention that kind of becomes a little bit important later on in my presentation is that we actually do have two dams in the watershed that kind of are in our headwaters region that hold back some of the water and help regulate flow. So I talked about watershed planning advisory councils. What the heck are we and what do we do? So we are a key partner in the Provincial Water for Life strategy. So this is a strategy that the province came up with back in 2003 after the last pretty bad drought that we had. And it basically is a provincial strategy that is aimed at providing safe, secure drinking water, healthy aquatic ecosystems, and reliable water supplies for a sustainable economy. It also identifies different partners and their roles in kind of contributing to meeting those goals. So there's the government of Alberta, so they have all the responsibility and accountability and all the decision-making power. They're the ones that make the rules and can enforce them. There's the Alberta Water Council, and so they bring groups of people and organizations and communities together to come up with policy advice related to water to kind of guide the government. And then the watershed planning and advisory councils, we kind of focus on the individual watersheds and we come up with watershed management plans. We help implement them. We do assessments to say, how healthy is the water? How's the water doing? What can we do to improve it? And then we bring people together and we support communities to try to improve the health of the watershed and make the water healthier. And then we also have the watershed stewardship groups, which are even on a like more local scale where it might be focused on one individual lake. Like there's a group in Wabamun, for example, to focus on Wabamun Lake. So as a WPAC, kind of our key responsibilities, as I mentioned, are to convene and collaborate. So bring people together, make them work together, make them talk. We do a little bit of planning and policy, just policy guidance. We don't have any regulatory. We have no regulatory teeth. We can't enforce anything. We also do monitoring and reporting. And then a huge part of what we do is education and outreach. So getting out into communities, talking to people, talking to governments and municipal staff, and kind of teaching them about the watershed and what we can all do to make it healthier. So why do we care about water and watersheds? So not just in Alberta, but everywhere, water is essential for things like public health and safety. We all need to drink water. Everything needs it to live. Agriculture, obviously, we need water to produce everything that we need to eat. Aquatic environment, we need water just for aquatic environments to exist and for there to be healthy fish populations and wildlife populations and recreation and things we like to do. Also for industrial applications, so oil and gas, power plants, factories and plants. And another thing to note is that we also need to care about water because we actually have these agreements. Every province has them. If you kind of have a river that flows into the next province where you have to make sure that you're leaving a certain amount of flow in the river to go downstream. So Alberta can't just take all of the water and then be like, sorry, Saskatchewan and Manitoba, good luck, guys. So it's kind of that to make sure that we're being fair and that every province is being fair with this sort of common resource that everybody needs to survive. So on that note, I'm going to talk a little bit about water supply and demand and what that looks like in the North Saskatchewan River. So on a provincial scale, this is sort of what it looks like. You can see this map. Blue means more water, green and orange and yellow kind of mean less. So it's not overly surprising that, you know, down in kind of the Drumheller area, it's a lot more dry because it's kind of a desert. And most water is actually available in the north in Alberta. So about 80% of our water supply is available in the northern part of the province. But conversely, or unfortunately, most of the population, so 80% of the population is in the south. So kind of that Edmonton, Calgary region and everybody in between and around. And so that can kind of be a little bit tricky. Another thing to keep in mind with water supply is that it's very seasonal. So if you think about kind of the seasons that we have here, most of the water is available during the spring and the summer. So what this graph down here shows is the amount of water entering the river throughout the months of the year. So you can see over here is winter when everything is frozen. If there's water flowing, it's under the ice. Precipitation is locked away as snow for now. And then you kind of see this really big increase. That's in the spring when everything melts and we get that big pulse of water through the system. And then kind of through the summer, flows kind of decline, and in the fall, they kind of start dropping. So I'm sure that you all have noticed that if you have driven by a river in your life. But so this is really important to keep in mind with water supply and starting to think about water storage. So making sure that we're capturing water kind of in this period instead of getting to here and being like, oh no. So in Alberta, so this graph sort of shows the water demand. So kind of like we have all this water, we say who can use it, we have licensing, where does it go? So if you look at kind of the southern part of the province, it's not surprising. In the Old Man and the Bow, most of it goes to agriculture because they have a lot of irrigation down there. So if you drive through those watersheds, you'll see dams, canals, control structures, reservoirs. So that's sort of the biggest demand in the south. But then when we get up to the North Sask, the biggest water license that we have in the North Sask River is actually for industry. And so something to keep in mind with this again is that some sectors only use water during specific seasons. So the water demand isn't the same throughout the entire year. And something to note is that this year, all sectors have been called to reduce water usage by 30%. And so most of the sectors, so like industry, oil and gas, they're all kind of agreeing to do so. And another thing to note is that because we have these regional differences in what the water demand looks like, the water management framework is different for each river. So there isn't kind of a blanket provincial policy that guides water allocations in the rivers. So in the North Saskatchewan River, we don't have a water management plan, mostly because we're under allocated. So we are allowed to use up to 18% of the flow, and typically we only use about 4%. So we're doing pretty good. We're not over allocated. We're not drawing too much or at that limit. So we don't have a water management plan. So we fall under this surface water allocation directive. And something to note is that the basin is still actually open for more licenses to withdraw water because we're under allocated. So kind of zooming in a little bit more on kind of what the water demand looks like in the North Sask. So after industry, which is about 80% of the use, municipal is about 16%, agriculture is 1%, commercial is 2%, and then water management, which is stuff like if you are building a road or doing culvert work and you have to kind of divert the water, there's a license involved in that and stuff. So that's kind of that water management piece. So something interesting is that for the municipal sector, even though they're the second largest water allocation, the vast majority of that, so about 70% of the water is returned to the river. So it comes out, goes through the water treatment plant, people use it, goes to the wastewater treatment plant, goes back into the river. So it's that isn't a fully consumptive use, like there's water going back. So now that we've talked a little bit about kind of water demand and kind of who's using the water and how it's being used, I'm going to start talking about drought. So what is drought? So it's a prolonged period of dry weather that depletes water resources from rivers, lakes, reservoirs, dugouts, and soil moisture. And there's different types of drought. So there's different definitions and different kinds of drought that we can be in. So sometimes you'll hear these terms used, especially in sort of the news or especially in kind of the provincial information that are coming out. So the first one that I'm going to talk about, and usually this is the first sign of drought that we see, and it's called a meteorological drought. And so all that means is that it occurs when there's less precipitation than average over a prolonged period in a specific region. So that just means we're not getting the same amount of precipitation, so things are starting to feel a little bit dry. If that keeps going for long enough, we can enter into what's called an agricultural drought, which is where there isn't enough soil moisture to meet the needs of crops and pastures during the growing season. So this is a picture from an Edmonton Journal article. I should have cited my sources, but I did not. It's from a news article. And this is a producer in the south, and this is his field in 2020 when we had quite a lot of rain, and this was last year. So you can see, and it's both in July, so you can kind of see the difference between a wet year and a dry year for sure.
I have a question.
Yes.
Who decides what area is classified as drought?
The province, the provincial government will decide that. So they have models. We'll kind of talk a little bit about some of the information that they use a little bit later on, but it's the province who will look at the situation and be like, this area is in a drought. As well as the federal government keeps track of that as well.
Okay.
Yeah, so the next type of drought is a hydrological drought. So this is a picture of the Crow's Nest River this year, this spring. So it's where surface water or groundwater levels fall below average because of the lack of precipitation. And so this type of drought is more likely to impact drinking water sources. So in the south, they're kind of getting to the point where there's a lot of discussion about how they're going to meet water demand because this is their situation right now. And then the last type of drought that we're going to talk about is a socioeconomic drought. And so that occurs when a region is in a drought for long enough that it starts to begin to impact people in the economy. So you start to see different trickle-down effects where there isn't enough water So then things get more expensive or there's loss. So there's lots of discussion around this right now and lots of studies for the last few years kind of saying like what this drought and what more extreme floods will cost Canada. So in the next 30 years, there's estimates of as high as like $139 billion hit to the economy because of floods, droughts, and storms. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of drought in the North Saskatchewan River watershed. So if you kind of think about when we started kind of tracking water levels in the river, kind of starting to collect data and information, it's kind of the late 1800s in Alberta. And so kind of some of the drought highlights, I guess, I don't know if that's the right way to describe it, that have sort of happened and that most people are familiar with is so in the early 1920s, things were good. It was really wet. We had a lot of agricultural production. A whole bunch of people moved here. And then a few short years later, we entered into drought. And that's when there was sort of like the Dust Bowl years of the dirty 30s. And so there was so many crop failures that the federal government founded the Prairie Farm Rehabilitation Administration to kind of try to support the agricultural industry. And then part of that was also constructing a lot of dams and kind of water storage infrastructure across the landscape. And then things were pretty good for a while. Things went back to being pretty wet. And then in 1979, we started another period of drought that lasted pretty much through the 80s. And in Alberta, that actually triggered the construction of the Old Man Dam and kind of some of the water infrastructure that we have in the south. And then the most recent kind of big drought that we had was in 2001 to 2002. And it affected most of Canada, similar to this one. And that one, it cost $5.8 billion to the economy. So that's where things got to that socioeconomic drought situation. And then the multi-year drought, kind of the dry cycle that we're in now, started in 2021. So we had a lot of precipitation in 2020, and then we started to see the signs of kind of that meteorological drought in 2021, the drop in precipitation, and that's kind of where things were in the last 100 years. But what's really cool is we can actually look back further than that, even though we weren't collecting information. So we can use different techniques to do this. And so this one is pretty cool. It's called dendrochronology. And so it's the study of trees and tree growth of the past to figure out past environmental conditions like moisture and drought. So how many people have kind of seen tree rings when you've seen a tree cut? Everybody, right? So basically tree rings, we can look at them over time and kind of use it as a record of past conditions. So if there's a wider tree ring, it means that it was wetter. If there's a whole bunch close together, it means it was drier. And so what we can do is this person in this picture has this little thing here, and she's actually taking a core of the tree. So she's kind of putting that in and kind of twisting it, and then you get like a core of the tree, or you can obviously cut it down, and then you can kind of see, well, you can see the tree rings. And so what I was referring to is you can sort of see that some of the tree rings are wider. So that indicates, you know, kind of normal moisture conditions. But if you look right in here, you can see that all of the lines are pretty close together. So that would indicate a really dry period or signal drier conditions and a drought. And so if you sample enough trees over enough of an area, you can kind of see this pattern in all of them. And then you can kind of confirm that it was likely a dry period. So for the North Saskatchewan River watershed, we have done studies like this, and we have data going back to 888-ish AD. And so what we can kind of see when we kind of recreate those river flows is that over, you know, all of those years, you can kind of see that we alternate between these periods of it's really wet, it dries out. It's really wet, it dries out. It's really wet, it dries out. So our landscape kind of goes through these periods of wet conditions and dry conditions pretty regularly. And as I mentioned, you can kind of do this over a larger area. So this has also been done in other watersheds, and we can kind of see in Swift Current that this is like around 1850, and it's a dry period that lasted for a couple decades is what it looks like. And then when you look at the Old Man and the South Sask, you can see that same period. So but overall, you kind of still see that like dry period, wet period, dry period. So that alternating cycle of flood and drought that, even just in our lifetimes, I'm sure we're all familiar with the cycle of flood and drought in Alberta, where it's super wet for 5 years and then we're in a drought. So that brings me to the current state of drought in the watershed. So currently, in Alberta, there's 55 water shortage advisories. So the province has monitoring equipment on a whole bunch of different streams and rivers and is able to look at the flow and then is able to determine when that flow gets too low and when there's a water shortage. And then there's an advisory that limits the use of that water body. So there's 55 of them. It resets in spring. It hasn't reset yet, so that number may change in the next couple weeks. And so what you can see between July 2022 and July 2023 is that last year we had pretty high temperatures and pretty low precipitation. And a lot of the precipitation that we got during the growing season was those like really like massive downpours. And so what can happen in drought conditions is that the soil gets so dried out. Like hands up if you've ever forgotten to like water a house plant and it's completely dried out. Guilty. And then, you know, when you go to water it, you pour the water in and like there's the poor little brick of dried out soil and it just kind of pools on the top and then drains down and it doesn't actually soak in. So that can happen with our soils if they've been dry for long enough. So when we get these big rainstorms, it doesn't soak in the same way it would if we got rain over a few days like we're getting now, thankfully. So then you're not getting that moisture soaking into the soils, and you can actually end up with flooding during a drought, which is very counterintuitive. But so we ended up with low precipitation. So even though we got a few rainstorms, so you can see that things are a lot lower this year, even compared to last year. So the province, you can actually find this on the provincial website. If you go to the Government of Alberta website, you can find a section devoted to water, and there's a whole section for drought that has all of this information and kind of all of the data and information they collect summarized into these types of maps. So this is the water supply forecast as of April 9th. And so this is basically just a forecast of what the water supply is going to look like from March to September. The disclaimer is that it can change. This is just predictions. And so you can see that for the most part in Alberta, the map is very, very red and orange and yellow, which kind of means that we're below average. And even in kind of the headwaters regions, you can see that we're kind of like hovering around that average. There isn't really any of the really wet conditions on this map. So pretty much all of the rivers in kind of the central to south part of the province are much below average or average. So that's sort of the water supply situation this year. In the North Saskatchewan River, we are thankfully not in critical condition for the main stem flow. So the amount of water in the river, which is good news for drinking water, because a lot of people, the vast majority of people get their drinking water supply from the river. It also means that if we need to, we can move it to other places where it needs to go. But that being said, in terms of agricultural drought, we are seeing kind of the dryness in the west and east parts of the watershed. So those indicate dry soil conditions. And again, like something to keep in mind is that the water demand in the North Sask River is low. So we're not likely to kind of see the demand and over allocation that we're kind of seeing in the south a little bit. And I mentioned that this would kind of come into play when I mentioned it earlier, but something else is that on the North Sask River, we do have control structures or dams that regulate the flow. And so the reservoirs, the level is looking good for this year. And so what I mean when I say that it regulates flow is, so on this graph, this kind of starts in January, goes through the spring and summer and into the fall. So the blue bars that are higher show before the dam, that's what the flow would have looked like. So you can see that in kind of the May, June, July, August, you kind of get a lot more flow. But with the dam, we're able to hold back some of that water and kind of store it and release it more slowly throughout the year, which is what the orange shows. So we're able to kind of control what the flow in the river looks like. So for the North Saskatchewan River right now, there's 3 water shortage advisories. Again, that may change in the next couple of weeks. And a reminder that this is only for the creeks and the water bodies that have data being collected. There's a lot of water bodies across the province and in the North Sask watershed that don't have that monitoring set up. So there's likely other low flow conditions, they're just not reported. And so this.
So is that something that you guys are going to be implementing?
I wish. So I should also mention that all the WPACs are not for profits, and we're a team of 6. We'll be 8 tomorrow once our 2 summer students start. So I wish that we could monitor the flow of every single water body in the or in the watershed, but it's really expensive. So we're trying as best we can. But that's also sort of under provincial jurisdiction to kind of support that type of work. So so now that we've kind of talked a little bit about kind of the history of drought and where we're at with drought, I want to talk a little bit about drought resiliency and kind of some of the things we can do to deal with a drought. A lot of you have probably heard in the news that obviously the government of Alberta is doing things to address the drought, as you would hope they would. And so one of the things that I did want to mention that they have is this drought management stages guide. And so this basically just goes through and kind of identifies how severe the drought is and kind of the different management actions that are being taken by the province. So right now we are in a stage 4, and we got to stage 4 last year. And basically what that means is that there's multiple parts of the province over a very large scale that are experiencing drought conditions. And so this is sort of the last stage before we go into stage 5, where it's kind of urgent and critical and emergency measures are brought in. And so what is meant by emergency measures is that if we go to stage 5, it gives the provincial government as well as local governments a little bit more control over things that usually they don't have control of. So an example of an emergency measure would be, let's say things get really dire and not great in the south. Municipalities could regulate the price of bottled water at the grocery store. So then you don't have kind of not so nice people taking advantage of water shortages and saying like, well, this jug of Culligan water is now $300, or this flat of bottled water is super expensive. It's to make sure that local governments and the government can put things in place to protect public health and access to water. Something else that you may have heard is that the province has appointed a drought advisory committee that's made up of 6 different experts that are kind of helping to collect and provide direction to the provincial government on kind of what their drought response should be. I believe it was late last year or very early this year, I can't remember. Every single municipality in the province received a letter that they needed to prepare a drinking water shortage response plan. And so what that plan looks like is that the community will go through and do a risk assessment. So figure out what are the risks for our drinking water supply, and then come up with different actions or solutions that can be taken and implemented. And then it outlines a plan of what that would look like if they have to implement the plan. And this was direction that was provided regardless of location. So even communities up in the north were told to do this, just in case. And as I mentioned before, all sectors are being asked to prepare for shortage and to reduce their consumption. So by up to 30% for some of like the industrial users, for example. And something else you may have heard of in the news that's kind of causing some alarm for some communities is that some of the communities in the south are actually negotiating what's called water sharing agreements. So that's basically where a community will talk to another community and negotiate, like, if we reach a water shortage, but you have water, will you kind of provide it? So what does water sharing look like in a shortage? So as far as I know, we haven't started doing that in our region in the watershed yet. And something else I wanted to mention is we've been getting a lot of questions about something called interbasin transfers. Has anyone read a news article about that or heard of that before? So it is incredibly not common. And in Alberta, we have kind of provincial regulations and policy that allows for, in an extreme case of drought, that if there is a watershed or a river that has a lot of water and there's one that is incredibly like in dire, severe need of water, they will actually transfer water from one basin to another. We don't like doing this for a lot of reasons. It's not great. You can also transfer things like invasive species that can become a problem. There's all sorts of reasons why we don't want to do it. So it's seen as like the very last, absolute last step. And in the history of Alberta, it's only happened once. And we hope that we don't have to do it again. But it's sort of been kind of brought to the forefront again that this is a thing that we're able to do in a severe drought. So there's been a lot of concern in basins like the North Sask, where it's like, well, we have water. Are we going to have to pipe ours down to the south? And the answer is no, for now. So one of the things that I wanted to touch on today is that one of the ways that you can kind of prepare for drought and be prepared is to make sure that you're staying up to date on the information locally. And so where you can find a lot of this is on different provincial websites and apps. So there is an app called the Alberta Rivers app that you can download, and that shows you kind of locally for all of the stations that are monitored close to you, what the surface water supply looks like in real time. So it's updated pretty regularly. And so it shows things like, what is the stream flow? What does the reservoir level look like? Are there any water shortage advisories, as well as kind of the water supply forecast? So you can download this app. There's also kind of how-tos on the GOA website that you can kind of go through to kind of help you navigate it and interpret it. Also on the GOA website, there's information about soil moisture. So there's the Alberta Climate and Atlas maps that sort of show the provincial picture. And then there's also the agriculture soil moisture situation update. And so you can go to the GOA website or just put that into Google and it'll pull up the page for you. And then you can download all of the different reports in PDF. And as you can see, they update them pretty regularly. So the most recent one as of yesterday was May 7th. And that'll kind of tell you the agriculture's soil moisture, kind of what's going on in your local area. And so something that we're always kind of touching on right now is that a lot of municipalities and communities are starting to get people to start thinking about their personal water use and especially how they can reduce. So this is kind of what the municipal water use or looks like for the asking people to reduce their demand. So just starting to think about like, how much water do I use in a day? So kind of your average typical house and household in Alberta for the bathroom uses about 100 to 150 liters per day. Laundry is 37 to 60. For kind of cooking and cleaning up your kitchen and doing all your dishes, it's 25 to 60 liters. Miscellaneous, 12 to 30. And when I was talking about how most municipal water use kind of goes back into the river, the consumptive use that we usually see is stuff like watering your lawn and garden, washing your car. And so starting to think about kind of how we use water in a day and how we can kind of start reducing that. And so part of that is demand management. And so one of the things to think about is that almost 50% of water usage is just wasted. So if you were to look at kind of your community as a whole, the different kind of leaks that are happening or the less water efficient kind of fixtures and things account for 50% of that water use. So that's 50% of that demand that we could just be not using. So kind of thinking about, you know, reducing, replacing things, repairing leaks, and thinking about how you can reuse water. So things like gray water systems or rainwater harvesting. And then the last thing I wanted to end on to segue into our other presenters this afternoon is talking about that a big part of what we can do is work to build resilient landscapes. So as I mentioned, the area and region of the world that we live in has seen for many, many, many centuries this cycle of flooding and drought. Our systems evolved over millennia to deal with this cycle of kind of going between these two extremes. But in our particular region, we live in a pretty cool area called the prairie pothole ecosystems, and we have a lot of wetlands in Alberta. And so wetlands kind of evolved as a response to these cycles of flood and droughts. They are able to provide water a place to go in times of flood. So if you kind of look at the landscape, you see all of these little wetlands, and they kind of provide these depressions where water can go during times of flood. And then the other thing that they do is they hold the water during drier times and release it slowly. They recharge the groundwater. So they kind of act as sponges on the landscape. And so something to keep in mind is that even though we have this long history of drought and floods in the province, and like our histories in the kind of tree cores show that we've had droughts more severe than the ones that we've seen even in the last 100 years. The landscape has changed a lot because there's 4.8 billion people in Alberta that are living and using the land base. And so starting to think about how can we build resilient landscapes? How can we bring back some of these landscape features that evolved with this cycle of flood and drought so that we're able to have the landscape and our communities be more resilient? And so this is the plug for all of the great organizations that are doing this type of work and have different programs that are available to you. You will be hearing from Nancy, from Alice next about some of that, and then Cows and Fish this afternoon. There's different organizations that will kind of help you plant trees on your property if you want. So that's Oz Agro Extension Society, for example. So if you're interested in that, there's lots of information and lots of people that are doing this great work across the watershed and the province to try to make sure we all have water for the future. So with that, thank you for listening, and any questions?